Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of the Security Ledger podcast. I'm your host, Paul Roberts, and I am thrilled to be back in the studio once again with my good friend, Josh Corman, founder of I Am The Cavalry, and currently working at the Institute for Security Technology, IST, on a program called Undisruptable 27. I reached out to Josh because if you're like me, you've been reading in recent weeks about a whole campaign of cyber attacks on critical water infrastructure, particularly in the UK. The bigger story is it's not just the UK. They've been happening here and in Canada and in other parts of Europe for a long time. And this is a problem that Josh has actually been spending a lot of time and energy on researching and looking for solutions. And he's actually got a program, Undisruptable 27, that is really focused on this issue. So I thought, what a great time to have Josh on. First of all, to talk about what happened. Second of all, to think and talk about solutions to the possibility that bad actors could shut off our water. Josh, welcome.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Great to have you back. Okay. So first of all, if folks aren't familiar with I Am The Cavalry and IST, Institute for Security and Technology, just give us a quick overview of, first of all, I Am The Cavalry, which you founded, 12 years ago, and IST.
Sure. So I Am The Cavalry was my response when I was looking as far as I could high and deep in the federal government to see who the adults were, because I had growing concerns where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood, public safety, human life, dependence on undependable technology. And when I couldn't find any, I said, the cavalry isn't coming. And I asked the hackers, what are we willing and able to do? If the cavalry isn't coming, what can we do? So we tried to be a helping hand, voice of reason, lean into policymakers and safety critical industries to be safer sooner than if we just let it naturally matriculate. And I think we built a lot of empathy and trust, common cause, common purpose, and we've had pretty substantive impact on public policy, some laws, framing debates, and we made a pretty good dent. I think the issue is that dependency is still growing faster than our ability to secure it. So there's much more to do, but at least it's in the public consciousness now. IST is the Institute for Security and Technology. It's a public policy think tank based in the Bay Area to try to bridge Silicon Valley to public policymakers wherever. A trustworthy, transparent digital infrastructure. A lot of former National Security Council people founded it, but are really trying to accelerate the gap between inventing new things that can have impact on the public good and trying to have rational public policy discussions about it. When it became clear that I should start this project Undisruptable 27, I needed a good 501c3 home for that. And Craig Newmark was really eager to fund it and already had an existing relationship. Many people may know the Institute for Security Technology. They like to call themselves a critical action think tank, but for the ransomware task force, which has had a pretty big dent on the international public policy efforts for dampening ransomware.
It prompted me to reach out to you. I mean, we talk all the time, but the string of stories, Recorded Future and others, ran a couple of weeks back on a campaign of cyber attacks going back a year, 18 months, targeting water providers in the UK. That sort of got my antenna up like, ooh, what's going on? When you read into the stories, unclear whether they were just IT focused or OT focused, but it is part of a pattern. And so I want to get your thoughts, first of all, on what we've heard from the UK and how that fits into kind of the bigger pattern of threats against critical infrastructure, but in particular, critical water infrastructure.
Sure. This particular story wasn't that meaningful to me, but if it's a good hook to have an excuse to talk to you,
it's a news hook, Josh.
I'll take it. I'll take it. There are no mandatory laws for reporting attempted disruption in the UK. There's not clear or enforced standards of care in our other allied countries either. But this story basically said there were 15 reportable incidents to the UK government for water. They call it NIS. And 5 of those appeared to be some sort of hacking. None of them specifically rose to the level of disruption of service that would have mandated saying more. So they're trying to applaud the transparency and the proactive reporting, which I do too. This is not the only compromise of water in Europe. It's not the only compromise of water in the US or Canada. There's a lot of them. I'd like to touch on a few of them, even if we skim the treetops. And it's certainly not the core of my concern area over Undisruptable 27. But I'm glad people are seeing more of these. In fact, you and I are here in New England just within a month ago or so, 60 Minutes ran a 13, 14-minute piece on Volt Typhoon compromising Littleton, Massachusetts, 10,000 person town, saying why is the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, in a nobody town of 10,000 people with no obvious military or industrial strategic value. So that story has...
Littleton isn't a great town, because it is.
It is, yeah.
Yes.
But I think the town was flummoxed as to why us, and we're not resourced to do hand-to-hand combat with a Chinese military cyber unit. There's a range from maybe people were indiscriminately wholesale attacking vulnerable edge devices and front offices, and maybe got some UK water facilities, and 5 of them reported through. There's a deliberate attempt and successful attempt to do initial access campaigns on US water facilities in the case of a conflict with China, probably over Taiwan Straits as early as 2027. So I think the things that you and I know, but that we should possibly remind people, is when you add software to something, you make it hackable. And when you connect it to the internet, you make it exposed. So increasingly, with a really big surge during the pandemic for remote access and downsizing of staff and whatnot, we've made these smart connected OT or operational technology, ICS or industrial control systems. We've increasingly added software and connectivity to these basic human lifeline needs like water and power and food and access to emergency care, but without the requisite risk mitigations to do it in a sound way. So what you have is hyper exposed, very vulnerable, that are now exposed to accident like the CrowdStrike outage, or adversaries that want financial gain, let alone weapons of war. So I don't believe the UK article attributed these 5 events to a criminal group or a military group, but I'm glad they mentioned in there part of the Iranian cyber Avengers blast radius. After the unpleasantness with Israel and Hamas, there was a cyber Avengers attack out of Iran that hit 22 states in the US that were using Israeli-made equipment, unit electronics, really for a defacement protest to say, why are you using Israeli equipment? It did create an outage in the UK, not in the UK, but in Ireland. I believe they quoted in that article. When you're exposed to accidents and adversaries, different predators are going to have different motives for the different prey, and are going to have different payloads. So I think what this reminds us is we are exposed to accidents and adversaries, and depending on who comes knocking, it could be a minor inconvenience. It could be a ransom payday. It could be a denial of lifeline critical functions. And at least, or not to my project, but some very bad things happen very fast when you shut off the water.
So you noted, and this was pointed out in some of the articles, that, currently the laws in Great Britain they require you to report disruptions, but not things that most folks who are cyber fluent would say are equally as concerning, which would just be unknown actors, malicious actors getting a foothold in your network or attempting to establish persistence, which, it may not shut off your water, but of course they're just positioning themselves to be able to shut off your water. So that's a distinction without a difference. But as easy as it might be to criticize the UK on that, as I understand it, there isn't really disclosure laws in this country covering that either.
Yeah, I mean, we all remember after Colonial Pipeline, there was bipartisan, bicameral support to pass CERCIA to make mandatory reporting within a couple days if you're designated critical infrastructure. The trade associations and lobbyists did everything they can to take a very simple law that passed nearly unanimously. And we still don't have initial proposed rulemaking because everyone was a beautiful, unique snowflake and wanted special handling. Am I too small? Am I too big? Am I an exception? So we don't have the reporting, but probably more germane is the Biden White House under the 5-pillar strategy in recognition after SolarWinds and Colonial basically said, hey, there's a time and a place to use regulatory power. That time is now, such that we want to use a light touch, but no lighter than required to maintain the trust and safety of the public. And they asked existing regulators with unused or underutilized regulatory authorities, can you lean in? We'd already seen that happen with NERC and FERC in the energy sector, and it's a pretty positive collaborative relationship between the public-private partnership. Whereas a lot of these things are voluntariness standards or overlays to the voluntariness standards. And after some success from the White House National Security Council on pipelines with TSA, the very next mover was the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which has regulatory authority over water and wastewater. And the initial response from that sector was, how dare you, we're suing you. And there were 3 states that brought cases and ultimately rebuffed. And
in addition to
EPA,
industry groups, right?
Yep. Some trade groups as well. But they were like, how dare you? And it wasn't even to require cybersecurity controls be in place. It was just merely saying that your annual sanitation survey, can you tell us which of the 38 CISA cyber performance goals you have? A tiny crawl subset of the overall NIST cybersecurity framework, like inventory for us what you got so we can get some ground truth. And even the idea of an inventory was too much. So that was a pretty loud signal that the industry doesn't have the resources to, or feels they don't have the resources to defend this hyperconnectivity. But then a couple months later, it's January 31st of 2024, and there's the 4 horsemen of the cyber apocalypse in an unclassified hearing saying to Congress and to the American public, hey, Volt Typhoon is a military unit in the PLA, People's Liberation Army in China. They have a campaign to successfully compromise and maintain initial access on U.S. water and power. This is not a spy unit, whereas spycraft is fair play. Spies do spy stuff, but this is a military unit targeting non-combatant critical infrastructure, civilian critical infrastructure. It's outrageous, and it's wildly outside of norms for things like international law of armed conflict. But there's been no payload yet. So everyone is saying, how far up to the line or on the line can you get before it's an act of war or too transgressive? So I think with these public revelations that they are deliberately have access to U.S. water, it's scary on the left hand to say we don't want to or can't afford any sort of minimum cyber hygiene. And by the way, we're directly in the crosshairs of one of the world superpowers who has shown they are willing and able to target those vulnerable systems upon which human life depends with very little downtime tolerance.
If you were to talk to the people in Littleton about why they were targeted, what would you tell them?
So there's public information about Volt and there's non-public information about Volt, and there's debate and perspectives being shared. But let me zoom out and dodge the question slightly. The stated intent from Xi Jinping is he would like to reunify mainland China with Taiwan, and is told that's very public. Number 2, he's told his army be ready to take Taiwan as early as 2027. And the intent of the Volt type, and since unrestricted warfare includes many different technologies and types of combat, cyber is but one of them. In the military cyber sliver of that overall national imperative and timeline, the idea with Volt Typhoon is we would like the U.S. to stay out of the fight. So this is twofold. One, if the U.S. interferes, Volt could rain chaos on U.S. soil, undermining public support for our intervention and focusing leadership on domestic turmoil, and could delay or degrade force mobilization or the movement of troops and missiles and warfighting equipment. Even a day or 2 or 3 would be sufficient to give a military advantage in the theater. To that extent, you don't merely want to target just military bases. The part of the point is to undermine public support. So chaos, maybe have the population question. It's a funny word. I do suspect that there is specific targeting or some logic that goes into which of the nation's 151,000 water and wastewater plants are part of this sweep, but also some of it is indiscriminate as to a lot of these initial access campaigns use very known exploitable vulnerabilities in edge devices, or they use orbs that are home equipment that can be brought to bear to go target these very vulnerable systems, as many of them have direct human management interfaces or HMIs directly on the internet. Your panelists from Vegas, Silas Cutler at Census.io, they had done a project where they found a ton of HMIs for water, brought them quietly to the EPA and helped get them taken down. They're constantly popping back up because many of these OT ICS equipment manufacturers are both making vulnerable exposed equipment and then forcing them upon their install base and their customers for either predictive maintenance or some sort of service contract or subscription. But sometimes it's good for the water plant, sometimes it's good for the manufacturer, sometimes it's good for both, but all of them are adding elective exposure, sometimes recklessly. So the hard-coded passwords, no password, no multi-factor auth, whatever these things might be. So we're getting a lot of that convenience that we haven't paid the risk management bill. So they're getting in a number of different ways, and the access campaigns are ongoing. So some of the numbers bantied around at the time of the Littleton story when it broke 10 months ago, 11 months ago. That was one recruitment drive, and many of our mutual friends are tracking additional access drives.
That is the thing of, yes, Littleton got discovered and ended up on 60 Minutes, but that certainly does not mean that Littleton was the sole focus of that campaign.
No.
There may have been many other communities that are compromised and don't know it, or were attacked and defended themselves and turned back the attack, but make notice of it. And as we said earlier, there is no requirement for them to disclose this.
Yep.
And so it's a little bit of a black box.
Yeah, and there's different actors on the field doing different things. We mentioned the UK story, unclear who it was or even if it was the same five. During the pandemic, when I was running the Cisco task force, we were starting to see a lot of disruptions to Lifeline infrastructure. And the one on the news at the time was during the Super Bowl in Florida, there was the Oldsmar, Florida, that emptied poisonous levels of lye into the reservoir, didn't make it out to the public, later debunked, or at least claimed to be not really a hack, but something else. So a little ambiguity around that. But we had the cyber Avengers hit the electronics equipment. You had the cyber army of Russia reborn overflow water tanks in Texas. There's other international incidents from the cyber army of Russia reborn, a criminal group, not a military group, even though it sounds like an army.
As we know, in Russia, those lines are blurry, right?
Absolutely. State tolerated versus state directed. Yeah. Same thing with Iran. But there is, in fact, ODNI, who almost never publishes stuff like this, they published a PDF showing Russian hacktivist hits on critical infrastructure in the US and Iranian activists or hacktivists. And it would say what kind of attack it was, at water or power or municipal. But there's quite a bit on that map in just a very short time window that they chose to publish. Mostly, I think, to illustrate the existence proof that whether they're foreign militaries, foreign intelligence, or foreign supporters that we have potential for warfare with, they can and have reached out and touched Lifeline functions. And I think Volt is an example of maybe part deterrent, part ability to disrupt as part of all-out unrestricted warfare as early as 2027, probably after this presidency is the chatter. But when Trump was rumored to be unwell and unhealthy and maybe dying a couple months back, there was chatter that they may go sooner. So the fact that I think one of the things that our threat intelligence friends dismiss about Volt is that it hasn't really done any damage yet, but that's the design. It's an initial access campaign for future use. Do you feel comfortable if I could tell you and show you that there's evidence of someone entering your house when you're not home, or even when you are home, but they haven't stolen anything yet, or they haven't hurt anyone yet? Would you feel comfortable knowing there's fairly at will access to your home? No, you wouldn't feel good about that.
Right.
And it's not, even with this particular one, which is the apex predator here that I'm most concerned about. Even when you know what you're looking for, it's hard to find, because they're doing those techniques like living off the land. They're not really dropping malware, or there's going to be obvious TTPs. They've harvested logins and credentials, and they're just going to look like normal business, even when you know to look. So it's unlikely to be something you could do hand-to-hand combat or eviction with for the 151,000 water facilities or the subset that get swept up. In fact, one of the most disheartening things I saw in that 60 Minutes piece with Littleton is one of their talking points is they spent $50K re-architecting and trying to evict their visitor. And I doubt they're going to be able to keep that visitor out if that visitor wants to come back. So I'm not in the camp, as a longtime cybersecurity pioneer alongside you. I am not advocating that we cyber up or shields up here. I'm actually, in the time frame and the budget that we have for these target-rich cyber poor, I'm encouraging that we engineer down consequences. We assume they can get in at will. We make sure that the worst case damage that I dread can be mitigated cheaply in a way that's both cost effective and familiar using engineering.
which brings us to Undestructible 27, which is the project you're working on in conjunction with the IST. Talk a little bit about this project and how it came about and what you're doing.
Sure. Much like the spirit of I Am the Cavalry, where the cavalry isn't coming, we're on our own on this. Last January 31st, when I saw that hearing and I saw very little daylight between Christopher Wray of the FBI, Jen Easterly of CISA, outbound General Nakasone of NSA and Cyber Command, and Harry Coker from White House Office of National Cyber Director. They're all saying basically the same thing pretty bluntly about both Typhoon. And I looked around, and we have some best practices. We have a lot of voluntary stuff. It's usually concentrated with the haves, not the have-nots. And most of these lifeline critical infrastructure sectors are target rich and cyber poor. They have very weak public-private partnerships, very little required cybersecurity hygiene, very little assistance or investment. The cybersecurity industry doesn't really care about them because they don't have any money. So this long tail of very vulnerable, ripe target population. And I knew that no matter who got elected in the presidential race and congressional races that were coming up, we'd have at least a changing of the guard, which is a tactical advantage to our enemy. And I didn't expect the federal government was going to be able to do much. I had worked with inside CISA. I knew that when they're stretched, they can do some magnificent things, but there's a lot of things they can't do, and there's a lot of things they can't do sustainably yet. So I realized somebody has to do something. I held a session at the RSA conference called Getting Serious. Some of it was on the record and recorded. Some of it was off the record, Chatham House. But we said, if things are getting serious, it's time that our talent pool gets serious about it. And we want to see is there any willingness or appetite to lean in on our most exposed? Because when everything's critical, nothing is. So I said, what are the things that if you shut them off for 24 to 48 hours, people die? And it was the water you drink. It was the electricity and fuel for our homes and our economy, and timely access to patient care. And maybe the food we put on our table has a little bit more tolerance, but not much. So let's focus on the lifelines and the target rich cyber poor. And this is a typhoon. So let's treat it like a natural disaster, like a hurricane or a wildfire. But unlike natural disasters, which are somewhat isolated and count, and we can handle them with emergency management, and we have playbooks for them. These unnatural disasters can be concurrent and coordinated and correlated. And a lot of the ways we handle emergency management don't scale past 3 or 4 concurrent things in the state. So I said, look, we can't exclude and infantilize the public. These target rich cyber poor are mostly small, medium, and rural. They're not participating in public-private partnerships. They've never heard of cyber. They can't spell IOC. And yet, if a hurricane was coming, we wouldn't keep it from them. We'd tell them what we know, tell them what we don't know, level with them. We'd inform, influence, inspire. And when you're not hopeless or helpless, we could say, maybe it's not shields up, but connections down. Maybe there's some engineering mitigations. Maybe you can do some hand-to-hand combat if you feel up for it. But we have some time to do something. And we also realize that we don't have a common language. So this is going to be a lot of empathy, meeting people where they are, use their love language, storytelling, creative arts. So it was a mix of learning emergency management, learning how water engineers talk, how power engineers talk, how municipal leadership, you're involved in local government, the completely different species than federal government. And we started making some videos and learning about water hammers. I said, what's the worst that could happen if you went evil as a water manager, as an engineer? And they said, oh, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, but the one that would really be a bad day is if a complete loss of pressure, either through an overpressurization or a burst water main from a water hammer. We had to learn from them. We said, okay, what can we do about it? And we said, a fully compromised water plant, just like your house has a circuit breaker, so that a surge in electricity doesn't burn down the house. It just flips switch. Is there such an equivalent that could mitigate the threat of a water hammer? And it turns out there is. For $2,000, maybe $4,000, you can do pressure sensor arresters. There's a couple different ways to skin the cat, but they're familiar engineering solutions. So we busted out. Idaho National Labs has this concept called cyber informed engineering. You might remember Andy Bachman doing a big push for that years ago in Harvard Business Review. And they call it cyber informed engineering. I'm lovingly ignoring that name. I call it consequence informed engineering. And they let me. But a lightweight version of this is basically, what's the highest consequence thing we can do? And are there engineering things we know how to do and can afford to do to buy down total impact? So you didn't ask this, but I'll tell you that it turns out in the first year, we tried to see, is there any there, and can creative storytelling build the empathy and the trust to maybe catalyze action? And the answer was yes. We looked at the nexus of water and hospitals. As it turns out, no water is no hospital in about 2 to 4 hours. There's no HVAC, no fire suppression, no sanitation, no surgery scrubbing, no nothing. Really quickly, a hospital cannot. In fact, in some cases, in the extreme heat in Arizona in the summer, you got to evacuate the building in 45 minutes because you'll cook humans at 117 degrees with all glass building in Arizona in the summer. So some cases it's evacuate. In other cases, most services just stop. And while every hospital has a diesel generator, they don't have an abundant supply of clean potable water if the water pressure goes. So we zoom out and we said, okay, there's 151,000 water facilities in the US. Do you know how many participate in the ISAC? The Information Sharing and Analysis Centers?
Yeah, I'm going to guess that it's less than 1%.
It is 650 members. So
Wow.
it's 0.4%. And they're the haves, right? They're going to represent more population.
The larger ones. Yeah.
But out of 151,000, we can't get to them all in a year and a half or two and a half years. So year one was proving the value and figuring out, is there a credible theory of change that could buy down risk enough for our highest consequence failures? Craig Newmark of Craigslist funded this, the initial pilot. He was pleased with the results of both the storytelling and the pragmatism of educating the public, but also not terrifying them and giving actionable, meaningful mitigations. At Critical Effect in June, which is the love child of Hack the Capitol and Undisruptable, we've merged them until this is over. He announced another round of support of $3.2 million for the next 2 years to see this through. And what we're doing with it is, I said out of 151,000 water facilities, 6,000 of them support the nation's hospitals. If no water, no hospital within 2 to 4 hours, then you can look at those communities, those zip codes that support a hospital. And maybe you can't even protect every part of the town, but can you look at the pressure zone that supports the hospital and make sure that the worst case of a water hammer or similar or other hazards, of course, and in our engagements, we walk through them that are fit for purpose for that town. But if we know that we could say even a successful attempt to hurt this town will not hurt the water pressure for the hospital, and we are confident it cannot hurt the water pressure for the hospital, then do we basically make sure that we will take a punch, but we can handle that punch and keep fighting, keep standing. It's a much more merciless, ruthless prioritization exercise to say, what's the best way to get to 6,000? 6,000 is a lot. So in this round two, I'll say it as quickly as possible. We basically are trying to do an experiment, a theory of the case, that if we pick 12 hospital communities as diverse as possible, some red states, some blue states, different size of community, different age of pipes and infrastructure, different elevations, a flood zone, a port city, at altitude, gravity fed. Can we surface enough edge cases that we can innovate narrowly on these 12 diverse communities, replicate widely, so that once we meet them where they are on the ground, brief them on Volt, co-create what's the worst that could happen and reasonable, affordable engineering mitigations, maybe even help them implement or fund those mitigations. Now we've got 12 sets of stories and stakeholders that can be the best ambassadors to their peers. We've got what works and what doesn't, capture their beliefs before, during, and after, their success stories. And then we can take those and push those through a 60 minutes, through congressional hearings, through trade associations, and say, hey, if this is of concern, here's a couple of really smart and affordable things you could do to make sure that you don't have a really bad day. It's a very challenging, very time-boxed problem.
I think one of the things that you see, particularly in small communities, but I would say probably everywhere, is that these critical infrastructure providers are very bottom line focused. Many of them are very resource constrained. And even if they're publicly owned, they are focused on at least meeting their costs and trying to have a positive financial situation, keep their overhead low, and so on. Cybersecurity will definitely get heads nodding, but when it comes to prioritizing expenses and expenditures, it's much more on the concrete problems that they know about: upgrading old infrastructure, metering and billing and customer relations, things like that. The cyber stuff just seems very esoteric. And yeah, it's a problem. It's not our problem. That's the federal government's problem, the state's problem, or the FBI's problem. And we don't have the resources to address it. Does that kind of ring true to you in terms of some of the conversations you've had with local water providers?
A little bit. It depends on our flight path, our approach, our method of
Yeah.
approach, and our argument. As you can imagine, most of them have never heard of Volt Typhoon. There's some, if they have heard about it, I call them my top 5 thought terminating cliches. In fact, I showcased them. I gave a great talk at RSA. It was a risky talk, but it worked. Called War Games 2027 at RSA this year. It's recorded and I think it's free now. There's other ways to see it as well. But there's 5 thought terminating cliches that everyone goes through, and it's not usually a cost thing. It's usually why would they target me, or who would do this, or why 2027, or don't I have insurance for this, or doesn't the military protect us if this is warfare, or don't we have mutual assistance agreements like we do for wildfires? And we basically just touch on each one, and they fall apart almost instantly in this scenario.
Mhm.
And so I had to rattle the cages with the insurers. There's CyberAccuView, which is the top 25 underwriters and reinsurers for cyber insurance. And this is not covered. An active war is not covered. Infrastructure outages for business disruptions are not covered. So in a lot of cases, they either won't have the capacity to handle this level of concurrent disruption, or there'll be very clear exceptions and exclusions to coverage, but the public doesn't know that. So we normally go through those 5 thought terminating cliches. Sometimes when I was doing early experimentation, someone would say we have no budget, or the budget's approved a year in advance. Generally, the method we use to try to not shock and surprise somebody or never embarrass anybody publicly by going individually to the water owner and operator and engineers or the hospital engineers before we went to the town. The best advocate is the hospital cannot afford any downtime, or the water engineers are saying it is every time we have a burst water main, this is the cost of the town. And we can't afford that. And I'd rather spend $2,000 to avoid a burst water main than the time and disruption to the whole town and maybe even the hospital to do this. So I can't give them a magic budget. I can't make them do a rational survival thing. But what we do believe is we can inform them and be forthright and don't exaggerate and don't downplay. And we can talk to them and work them through it and start asking, what's the worst that can happen? What can we do about it? And they can still choose to ignore it. Some towns are going to say, look, we're not hyper-connected. We feel we're safe, or we just hyper-connected, but we're willing to roll back. Some towns are going to say, there's no going back. We're going to have to cyber up and maybe add some engineering. Mm-hmm. Some towns are going to say, we'll take our chances. But then I don't love the 60 Minutes piece on Littleton, but one of the nice existence proofs of it on mainstream news coverage is Littleton's not special either. That's the point of the campaign. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's a single argument that wins things over. We saw one that was pretty combative where the hospital leadership was screaming at the mayor, saying, how can you be so reckless to put us in danger? Our downtime tolerance is like this. I don't want to see a screaming match every time, but it was quite animated and motivated. Whereas in other cases, if we lay the groundwork and we're patiently impatient and we make sure no one's surprised or embarrassed, there's going to be a phased approach. You can see it in the RSA talk I had done, or I actually think we recorded it on the final day of our B-Sides Las Vegas track, which you spoke at. The phased approach was we went initially to the owners and operators, gave them 6 months to go through their 5 stages of grief. And then we're going to now pivoting to municipal leadership, where the people sitting at the table with the city planner or the town council, who will go through their 5 stages of grief. Everyone sitting at the table has already done that, and they're going to be ready to show up with good answers and good solutions. Mm-hmm. And then after we feel like we've done enough of that for those communities, then we'll turn up the heat and we'll start equipping citizens or, volunteers like yourself or other hackers or IT people that are willing to go to the towns they live in and say, here's 5 questions you can ask your next town hall meeting. And they may feel flat-footed, but it's also going to be combined with, here's a bunch of blueprints of success stories from towns that look just like yours. So we think the ability to scare somebody is proportional to the ability to empower them and equip them to be successful. Right. You've seen me do some hard things, and you've seen some things take a long time, like many years.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that was 9 years, right? So I do know how to get some stuff done. This one's harder because it's something we haven't done before, and we have very little time to do it. The consequences couldn't be more severe. The body count on getting this wrong is pretty scary when you start doing back and napkin math. Just given the downtime tolerance is nearly non-existent. We only have 6,000 hospitals. It's a time-space problem. And not only will you not be able to care for the people that currently come through those doors, but under a disrupted heat, power, AC, water situation in a town, more people will need services than they won't have them. So this is a failure mode I don't want to see, and I can do my best to warn them.
Is there any notion that there's mutually assured destruction here? That something that might hold the Chinese back is that the CIA has integrated into their critical infrastructure as they are into ours, and that if they throw the switch, we're going to throw a switch on them, and they'll end up in the same situation.
Yeah, I told you I have my 5 thought-terminating cliches. I do have a handful of questions that security pros or intelligence community people throw at me. This is one of them. So that's not on the formal list, but it is increasingly coming up. Yeah, like Ron Gula and others in and around Cyber Command or other parts of the government that we know do at the pointy end of the spear for cyber, they'll usually say something, well, don't you think we could do the same to them? And I'll give you an unsatisfying answer that you maybe have heard from me in a different story. But the first time I went to Fort Meade to brief on the rise of hacktivism Anonymous, way before the cavalry, somebody asked me in a way that I only had 30 seconds to answer. They said, what does the hacker community think of our capabilities? And I said, I assume we're really good at offense. We're really bad at defense. We probably take some solace in the assumption the same is true for our enemies. But as the most connected and ethical superpower, we stand much, much more to lose. And they said, oh, and it got me invited back for more types of briefings. And ultimately the one that led to the cavalry moment that we've talked about elsewhere and before. But I think my slightly modernized answer is I'm sure we could throw punches too. And there's a lot of discussion in the current administration about being more muscular and going on offense. I remind them every time your ability to throw a punch is predicated on your ability to take one. And we are going to get knocked flat. We have a glass jaw here.
The things that I think about is, and this often comes up more in the context of the power grid, we are somewhat unique among countries in this highly privatized infrastructure, privately owned electrical grids, privately owned water infrastructure in many cases that have their own lobbyists and their own industry groups and can, like you talked about earlier, can turn down laws and regulations that they don't like or feel are going to be too expensive. I don't know, but my guess is in China, that is not a phenomenon. That if the Chinese government identifies a risk and needs their critical infrastructure to adapt to address that risk, then it just happens. No questions asked, and probably happens pretty quickly. That is not the case here.
Yeah, you get a little bit of, remember the Dan Gear famous monocultures are bad. There's a bit of a competing philosophies of command and control and span of control for critical infrastructure. And at least in more autocratic countries, a unified sphere of control is more nimble. You may also have more class breaks. So we are more federated and diverse. So we have some biodiversity, but we're also have no span of control at all. So that is one factor I say is different. The other is, I don't think it's talked out of school to say that I think the Chinese Communist Party is willing and able to sacrifice their citizens or certain types of their citizens more than we are. And we at least try to or pretend to try to conform to international laws of armed conflict, crimes and treaties. And on this particular topic, we have in the plain light of day willingness to cross lines that the US does not yet cross in its classified operations. So yes, all things are subject to evolution or devolution. But I think in a toe-to-toe, blow-to-blow punching match, I think we have disadvantages. And I don't think that's in debate. To tie this off, I'm not going to rest my protective strategies on national defense of lifeline critical infrastructure. I'm not going to hang my hat on, let's hope China knows that we can punch them too. So I'm going to do my part. If we want to throw punches or use that as a deterrent, fine. But I'm going to do my part.
The cost of being wrong would be very high. So we talked about Undisruptable 27 and Institute for Security and Technology. Are there other programs or initiatives that are going on addressing this type of problem, these similar problems around critical infrastructure that you feel encouraged by or are worth following?
I mentioned our B-Sides Las Vegas track on the cavalry track. It's all recorded.
I'll link to it.
Yeah. On day 3, we had Grace Mena from Berkeley's Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, CLTC. They do the clinics, but there are also a lot of Craig Newmark's cyber civil defense grantees, of which I am counted. We realize a lot of us take volunteers. It's not done consistently. It's not a single one-stop shop that if you're looking for a volunteer, where can I find them? Or if you want to volunteer, how do I find who needs help? So we have, I'm one of the I don't know what we call ourselves, one of the steering committee members that is trying to drive this thing called Cyber Resilience Corps, like Corps, like CORPS, like the Marine Corps. There's a pretty good podcast from Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. The most recent episode, like a week ago, or maybe it was
the one
Monday.
I was interviewed in. That one?
That one's fantastic too. But no, there's four of the Cyber Resilience Corps founders all talking about the program in pretty good detail. Yeah. So that episode is probably the best advertisement for the CRC, Cyber Resilience Corps. I don't think it's going to be at its full fighting strength nearly in time for this 2027 time horizon, or 28 or 29. It's more likely. It seems like Xi Jinping is going to wait until this presidency's over, but not wait forever because his time's running out.
Yeah.
Whether it's 27, 28, or 29, I don't think the CRC is going to be at its full fighting strength by then, but I Am The Cavalry and Undisruptable are in there. So that is one-stop shop place. One of the other initiatives that Craig funds that you will find in there is DEF CON Project Franklin, or it's as in Ben Franklin. When they launched, they were going to look at K through 12 target-rich cyber and try to buddy up hackers to municipalities that wanted help securing K through 12. They were going to do the Almanac, like the Farmer's Almanac, but the Hacker's Almanac for the annual DEF CON report, which they launched last year. But around the time I was talking up water, Jake Braun also had a soft spot when he was in the White House for water. So Jake Braun is running Project Franklin, and they've taken a slightly different complementary approach. What they do is they ask hackers, do you want to be a cyber advisor to a water facility? So they had 5 communities last year. They helped one-on-one buddy system. One of them got some pretty good coverage on NPR in Vermont and some other stories. So they're giving cyber advice on a longer time horizon. I'm not prescribing cyber because it takes cost and money to operate safely and securely. So if you look at me, as I'm biased towards hospital towns, not all water, and I'm biased towards engineering, familiar, affordable engineering solutions for the resilience of those hospital towns.
Right.
Whereas they're giving star cyber advice on a wider and longer timeline, maybe even pushing towards like affordable sector-specific managed security service offerings to get some scale. Right. I think we're pretty complementary. People have been confused by it, but I think what you have is a cyber exposure, but the hazard isn't all hazards: emergency management, engineering, crisis management, fallout. So I'm going to be and our volunteers are intensely focused on safety and cyber resilience within the Volt Typhoon Taiwan Straits time horizon. And we're going to then become an entree and an on-ramp to point people at other cyber advice and expertise that could be a fast follow. So in a crawl, walk, run, let's stabilize your engineering impact, drive down those consequences. Then we'll crawl, walk, run on voluntary best practices for cyber. So to me, it's an order of operations thing or how to help. But I think all of us over time are gravitating towards this Volt reality.
Josh, is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to say or talk about?
And I could talk to you for hours, and I could talk about this issue for hours. Heck, anybody knows me know I could talk about anything for hours. But the one thing that I don't want listeners to scratch their head on later is if you do look into Volt, you'll see that Volt is not deliberately targeting hospitals. That's true. And it'll still kill a lot of people from denial of patient care, from the second and third order effects on hospitals.
Sure.
So the key phrase is no water, no hospital, no kidding. And I'd like to make sure that at least for those 6,000 communities, if a punch is thrown, we can take the punch. Right. And if people want to protect other things besides hospitals, and they should, because dialysis centers need water. They're not usually in the hospital anymore. It's in a different pressure zone, maybe a different town. And no water means a lot of dead dialysis patients. So there will be other towns that have other equities and concerns besides hospitals. Right. But my belief is if we can show you the process to assess, engineer down consequences, and move on, you can rinse and repeat for whatever your high value resources are.
Yeah, the common theme with Volt Typhoon is disruption, right? It's not any particular infrastructure they're interested in. It is causing chaos in society and distracting.
And if the goal is disruption, what can we do to be less disruptible? Yeah.
Josh Corman, thank you so much for coming back on and talking to us on Security Ledger Podcast. We'll do it again, and I will make sure to link out to Undisruptable and all the other stuff, all the other great leads you gave us. Mr. Corman, thank you so much.
You too.